The views expressed in the following show are of the host, the guest, and the callers. The content of the following show, its accuracy, authenticity, and the ramifications of the use or application of said content is the responsibility of those speaking and listening, not the broadcast medium. All right, we are here again doing a special report. I talked earlier with George Jatras, who is a foreign affairs analyst, been around the world seeing these things firsthand. We had a nice talk about Syria. You can see that posted. And I asked him back to talk about what's happening in the Ukraine, because one of the things we talked about in Syria is that things seem to be inverted, that the U.S. appears to be backing the wrong side, if you will, on this, and exacerbating things rather than helping them. So I asked Jim to come back and talk with us, and he graciously agreed, and here he is. And welcome, Jim.
Thank you, James. Glad to be back.
On the Ukraine, I've been getting the information that really the rebellion in the Ukraine, which the U.S. is supporting, was kind of like the bad guys. In fact, I've heard them called as neo-Nazis. I've heard all these references on there. And that also Crimea in Russia is really more Russia kind of taking back, let's say, part that was theirs because the culture is Russian. And people also mentioned about it being a warm water port and all that. Can you kind of make heads or tails of all this for us?
Well, it's in some sense, Ukraine is like Syria. It's another game of three-dimensional chess. There are a number of complex factors there. But let me just say that I have been to Ukraine about 25 times between 2009 and 2000. I guess my last trip was in late 2013, just as the big political upheaval was beginning that involved the change of government from the former president Viktor Yanukovych to the current president headed by Petro Poroshenko. Just to put it in very simple terms, I think we need to keep in mind that Ukraine, since it became an independent state, essentially by accident in 1991, when the Soviet Union fell apart by basically a gentleman's agreement among the leaders of the 15 Union republics of the Soviet Union that they would dismantle the Soviet Union, that it was a very unstable state. And it was unstable for two basic reasons. One, it was horrendously corrupt, which it continues to be today, which in many respects it resembled Russia in the 1990s under Yeltsin, when the so-called oligarchs ran everything, that there was a very weak government, weak state, and essentially the people who had looted all of the publicly held socialist property into their own hands called all the shots, that most of the people were still quite poor, whereas these people were fabulously wealthy and controlled all the resources of the country. Well, in Ukraine, that has continued to be the case, where oligarchs not only run the economy, they still run the government. In fact, Mr. Poroshenko himself was the chocolate king, the oligarch in chocolate and many other industries in Ukraine, media and so forth. The other problem is that it is a very diverse country regionally, particularly between the south and east on the one hand and the center and west on the other hand, as to what is their identity, who are they as Ukrainians, even who is the right side in World War II. There were no easy answers. There was no consensus of who and what Ukraine is supposed to be. So during successive elections, you'd see this ping pong back and forth, almost like between you might say, referendum elections between Republicans and Democrats, between our so-called blue states and red states, except there was between blue states and orange states, so to speak, that you had the South and East voting for one set of parties, and you had the West and the center voting for a different set of parties. And what happened in February 2014 is that a president elected by the South and East was unconstitutionally removed by, there's no nice way to put it, a street mob. It was violent. Now, that's not to say there weren't legitimate complaints against Yanukovych. There was a tremendous amount of corruption in his administration, which was frankly breathtaking even by Ukrainian standards. But the solution to that would have been to vote him out in the next election. Indeed, there was an agreement signed on the night of February 21st, 2014, to provide for early elections that almost certainly would have removed Yanukovych for power sharing with the opposition up until that time. And instead, a mob captured the capital. He was forced to flee to Kharkov and eventually to Russia. And then the deal was off, and the anti-East, anti-South politicians seized control of the country with applause and support from Washington and from the European Union. At that point, the Russians, who, despite what you would hear in the American media, that were calling all the shots and gratuitously destabilize Ukraine, to my experience, were tremendously flat-footed, watching this crisis in a neighboring country, vital to their security, erupting, and only at that point decided they needed to act. And they acted in two ways. One is, since they already had forces stationed in Crimea at the Sevastopol naval base, pursuant to an agreement that was made at the time the Soviet Union broke up, supported local forces that wanted to take Crimea out of Ukraine and, as they saw it, reunite it with Russia. Let's remember that within the Soviet Union, Crimea had only been switched from the Russian Republic inside the Soviet Union to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic in 1954 by Nikita Khrushchev as an anniversary gift to Ukraine at the time of the original union between Russia and Ukraine. Apparently he was quite drunk when he did it, according to the way most people describe it. In any case, most people in Crimea were not particularly happy about being in Ukraine in the first place, and they certainly were not happy about seeing a president and a government that they had overwhelmingly voted for thrown out unconstitutionally by people whose bona fides and intentions they were not confident of. As far as the talk, by the way, of Nazi or neo-Nazi influence in Ukraine, I think it's one of those things where if you're opposed to the current crowd in Ukraine, you call them Nazis, and I think that's overdoing it. On the other hand, ignoring the influence of people who celebrate the pro-Nazi Banderist and Shulevich and Ukrainian People's Army, the groups that carried out not only attacks on Jews and worked with the Nazis in many respects, but, for example, massacred 100,000 Poles in the region of Volhynia in 1943 because they wanted to make it a more purely Ukrainian area. These people are celebrated in today's Ukraines on postage stamps and parades and things of this sort. And I think that's just wrong. I don't think it should be overestimated in terms of how important this is. But that influence is there. You see these red and black banners at demonstrations of the Ukrainian People's Army that has a very, very dark kind of blood and soil quasi-Nazi ideology. And I think it's amazing the extent to which the U.S. government and the European governments have tolerated that. But I think they also realize that the more moderate elements within the Ukrainian government really don't know how to deal with this themselves and can't push them very hard.
So if I can get simplistic on it, whose side is the U.S. supporting of this group? And, I mean, is this appropriate? Is this just another way to, basically go against Russia? That kind of, because Trump very disappointingly said that Russia would have to give back Crimea, which I thought was which is a little strange, because during the campaign he said Crimea is none of our business. Let the Europeans worry about it, which I think, frankly, is the right thing for him to say. This notion, by the way, that this is a matter of principle, that European borders cannot be changed by force. It's funny. Back in 1999, when NATO waged its war against Serbia to detach Kosovo from Serbia, a province of the Serbian state, and then push through in 2008 independence for Kosovo against any legal principle in world affairs, and something, by the way, that even 5 governments of the European Union have refused to recognize, and almost every state in the world with a separatist problem, including India, for example, and not to mention China, Russia, many others, refused to recognize, warned people at the time, don't do this.
this would be the first forcible change of borders in Europe since 1945. If you do this, you're opening the door to things you can't control. And the response from Washington, this was the Bush administration at the time, and the same policy was followed by Obama, and from the European Union was, oh, this is unique. Well, why is it unique? Well, because we say it's unique. Well, then when we had a crisis in Georgia in 2008, well, the Russians said, well, you know what? This is unique too. And we're going to support independence for Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Now, and the Crimeans, they don't want to be part of Ukraine anymore. Okay, that's unique too. So, there's some things, once you break them, you can't unbreak them. And people warned at the time in Kosovo in 2008. We didn't listen to them. And now I do think we have a more dangerous world where borders are determined by might, not by any concept of law. And that's just too bad now, I guess.
Some people have said that there's some kind of a secret weapon that the U.S. Army has, or what have you, the military has, because they've been getting pretty bold with Russia. In some of this is pre-Trump election, but one of the quotes I heard was that we would give them a beating, severe beating that they'd never had before. And I'm thinking, when's the last time we heard that? I would ask Napoleon, as Hitler. And we're dealing in a world now where, as far as I understand it, Russia could easily destroy the earth as the U.S. can. So there's a no-win scenario here. I mean, are they saying that they could take out all of Russia's nuclear forces, so that's why they're acting haughty? Are they just insane, or what?
I hope they don't imagine that. Von Clausewitz said that war is politics carried on by other means. And I hope that the politics are such that the politics do not go into a direction where that kind of thing becomes thinkable. Your viewers should Google something called prompt global strike. There is a program that is going to use what they call hypersonic weapons that can deliver a very heavy conventional payload, but one that is strong enough to compete with a low-yield nuclear device to any point in the planet within 30 minutes. And if it's based in forward bases, for example, the sort we're putting in Eastern Europe, ostensibly as defensive missile emplacements against Iranian weapons that don't exist, they could be delivered much sooner than that. Maybe some people think that some kind of a preemptive strike like that would work. The trouble is, and this is one of the problems with military technology, is the other people get a vote too. They develop technologies as well. Do we really want to be returning to the kind of 2 minutes to midnight on the nuclear clock that we used to see during the Cold War, or what we saw during the Cuban Missile Crisis? What is the interest we have in a place like Ukraine or Estonia or Syria that justifies that kind of risk to the survival of the American people, and frankly, possibly to their survival in the entire world? I just don't see it. And people, I think, literally would have to be mad to be thinking along those lines.
Talk about mutually assured destruction.
yeah, mad. That's right. Well, they say, whom the gods would destroy, they first make mad.
Yeah. I mean, I was really optimistic, and I tell you, I'm not trying to let Trump off for giving in to the deep state or what have you. I mean, it's a pretty. I can't imagine being in his shoes. But a lot of this whole Russian problem was done when they started to blame him for being a agent, and that's what kind of polluted the water. Now, I mean, let's face it. What would the mainstream do if he has a meeting with Putin, and they're sitting there shaking it up? See, look at they're smiling at each other. I mean, it's almost like they've burned the water ahead of them for trying to cool off this potential problem.
Absolutely. When we talk about what is going on domestically here, the effort to nip in the bud the Trump administration before it can get on its feet from the deep state, from the mainstream media, I have no doubt that his stated desire to improve ties with Moscow is at the very heart of that. Because not only ideologically does this go against everything that the neoconservatives and the liberal interventionists have been doing for the last 3 administrations before Trump, that there's just so much money, so much power, so much influence, privilege. I mean, just anywhere around here in the Washington suburbs, just look at the McMansions that spring up that they look like they came from the Loire Valley or someplace. As somebody once put it, they look like the Loire Valley as reimagined by Walt Disney or perhaps by Liberace. They're just gaudy, they're overdone, and they're people who are connected one way or the other to the huge gravy train of money that comes out of the national security state. It's really, in a way, again, from looking at it from a Soviet affairs lens, it reminds you of the distinction between the regular people and what they used to call the nomenklatura in the Soviet Union, the Communist Party membership and all the various elite associated with the party system. Except here, it's a duopoly. It's a cozy arrangement between the Republicans and the Democrats. And let's remember, the Republican establishment was as much opposed to Trump as the Democrats were. And we have a lot of Republicans, of course, who are complicit with the Democrats and the deep state and the media in trying to remove him.
Well, do you think, is it possible for Trump, I mean, he did talk with Putin. I don't know if that transcript leaked, but is it possible that he could give him some kind of assurances while he does this? Does Putin trust him? I know I'm asking you to read minds, but is it possible that Putin would trust him but doesn't trust the deep state? I mean, isn't this kind of like, aren't we getting involved kind of a neo-Soviet state here by doing all this? It's in its own way.
I think that's the case. I think Putin is a good Reaganite. Trust but verify. I think he's more than happy to see if Mr. Trump can deliver on trying to improve ties. But I think, for example, some people have this notion that, okay, well, all we have to do is reach out the hand to Moscow, smile, and then we'll gang up with them against the Chinese. Or we'll get the Russians to throw the Iranians onto the bus while we recreate Bush's invasion of Iraq 6 times over in Iran, and the Russians will be good with that. I don't think so. I think the Russians, first off, they think in terms of, believe it or not, Russia first. They think in terms of concentric circles around their country and around their security. Iran and China are neighbors. They know they have to get along with them. They look at them the same way we historically looked at the Western Hemisphere and Latin America, which should be the most important part of the world to us. Instead, it's the most neglected part of the world. I think it will take a lot for Moscow to take seriously American steps to improve ties. And there's reason for distrust on our side as well, but I think we need to engage and start to talk like civilized, normal, adult human beings. And I think Ukraine and Syria, we've already talked about Syria, but let's talk about Ukraine, is the place to start. It should be a neutral country. There's no way to force Ukraine either into the Russian camp or into the Western camp without tearing the country apart. Right now, tearing the country apart is the direction it's been going. I don't think that does Ukraine any good. Its economy is a basket case. It's not going to get any better the way things are going. Russia is still their largest investor, still their largest trading partner, despite everything that's happened. We've got to find a way to and some people have put this forward, to, so to speak, Finlandize Ukraine, as was the case of Finland back during the Cold War. And that just hasn't happened yet. I hope it will.
I just wish we weren't sticking our nose in all of this. We being the United States, I mean, I'm not personally, but I am by de facto, and it's like when Trump was saying, what if we didn't do all of these things in Libya, in Iraq, Iran? We spent trillions of dollars in there. Look at all the broken governments and all the terrorism aroused from it. It's like, can't you look at that and go like, don't stop doing it? Or is this the neocon type of agenda, which now we understand? I understand that the neocon is left and right. It's the deep state. It's got all of them involved. And we're on the outside funding this craziness. And it's like, and Trump is our hope, but I mean, we're asking an awful lot of him to stand up against all of that.
That's right. And by the way, in my opinion, it really just comes down to him. If something happens to him, and I do worry about that, I'm not just talking about impeachment. Something happens to him, and you might say the regular Republicans are back in power, are more than happy to play hand in glove with the Democrats and go back to the strip of Iraq and Libya and Syria and every other thing, and Ukraine. I don't think this ends well. I'll be quite brutal about it. I think if Hillary had won, people in Russia and maybe in China as well would have said to themselves, that's it then. War is unavoidable. It's going to come. Now it's just a question of figuring out what our options are and stocking up on iodine pills. And I really don't want to see that happen. I think Trump needs to look at this with his businessman's common sense to say, if he wants to make America great again, if he wants 3% growth, if he wants industries returning, manufacturing returning to our country, you can't flush $1 trillion down the toilet in some stupid war somewhere, having nothing to do with American interests. That will destroy his presidency the way, frankly, I think Bush destroyed his in Iraq, and for that matter, Lyndon Johnson destroyed his in Vietnam. And I hope he's got enough sense to see that. I think he does, and I hope there are enough people around him who share that common sense.
I hope and I pray. As I said before, it's the first president I'm actually praying for. So, but I do appreciate you spending and giving us this information. It really gives us the more to think about than trying to sift through a lot of this stuff that leaks out here and there. So I appreciate your time in coming here.
Thank you, James. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Okay.